Well, over the past few days, we've seen U.S. Marines deployed to the U.S. southern border. Is this going to do anything to secure our southern border? What will the role of the U.S. military be in providing safety here on the homeland? What about peace negotiations with Russia? What about those 2,000-pound bombs that President Trump allowed to flow to Benjamin Netanyahu? He even sent him a congratulatory video message about that. So much to cover, and rebuilding the Pentagon. One person we'll ask is Colonel Douglas Macgregor, who served under President Trump and actually was an advisor to President Trump at the Pentagon during the first Trump administration. And he's been an outspoken, I would say realist, not a critic, but a realist about the current state of the Pentagon and what's going on in the United States. So prepare maybe to have your narrative broken. Colonel Macgregor joins us now. I guess it's safe to say you might upset some people because, people have like a sort of a set narrative about things. And when you come in with facts, it sort of upsets some people. Colonel, good to see you.
Yeah, good to be with you.
Let's start with the southern border. So we saw, a large show of force. We see on television, helicopters landing U.S. Marines at one particular area. We're seeing thousands of illegal immigrants being rounded up. But something you brought up many, many months ago when President Trump announced that there would be a massive deportation effort, you said, how is it going to happen? How is the U.S. military going to work, to make this happen? That was one of the big questions you had back then. Do you have that same question now?
Oh, absolutely. I think what we're witnessing are attempts to score, quote unquote, short-term wins for the administration politically by seeming to do things that were promised to be done. And as you point out, there are narratives and then there are facts. So let's look at the southern border. Historically, whenever we've had problems on the southern border, the United States Army has been tasked with the responsibility to secure it and then run any deportation operations that were required. The last time we went through this was under Dwight Eisenhower. A major general from the Army was appointed in charge of both federal and state forces to round up and deport illegal aliens and secure the border. It was done. From 1846 to 1948, the United States Army was on the southern border. That's what they did. All these cavalry regiments and all these interesting romantic films with John Wayne made by John Ford, they're all on the southern border because that's where we committed the bulk of our mobile forces to deal with this wave of corruption that continues to wash over our border into the United States. Now, I'm very happy to see the Marines being employed in that way, particularly because right now the Marines don't have a mission. We have no amphibious requirements whatsoever in any kind of future war scenario. The Marine Corps has a lot of manpower, 180,000. So putting the Marines on the border is fine. If you're going to add some soldiers to it, that's fine. But where is the plan? There is no coherent strategy. Who is in charge? Who is in command? Is it the former Border Patrolman Tom Homan sitting in the White House, who comes out periodically to announce apprehensions of illegals and other good things happening in support of President Trump? I see no plan. I see no coherent strategy. We need that desperately because when you close down that border, at some point, if we do it, and I certainly hope we do, we're going to have a hell of a time with the drug cartels because you're cutting off billions in revenue and the drug cartels will be at war with us. Technically, I would argue we've been at war with them for years, only it will become much worse than anything we've seen recently. And yesterday, we had an incident involving firing from Mexico into Texas. And that's the tip of the proverbial iceberg. We don't seem to understand that drug cartels are extremely well armed with all the implements of warfare. So my point is this. President Trump, thank God you're there. We're so happy. Now give us the plan. What's the chain of command look like? What are the rules of engagement? How are we going to do this? Right now, none of those questions have been answered, and there is no coherent approach. We desperately need
that. Having a general in charge, being able to marshal a large aircraft for deportations, having in the same way that we strategize a war effort into Iraq or other areas, who do you think is in charge? Is it the border czar, Tom Homan, or is it the Pentagon?
No, I don't think the Pentagon is in charge of anything at this point. And remember, you're dealing with senior officers who regard border duty as the worst possible outcome. They don't see their respective services and the service bureaucracies benefiting from mission on the border, even though that's vital. It represents an existential issue for us. They don't see it that way. That doesn't buy big ticket items. That's not how you justify exotic new weaponry. I don't care about that. Neither should President Trump. We should get new people in charge as soon as possible. And you've got to be realistic about how you do these things. Turn this over to the Department of the Army. That's their job. It's written in their mission. They're supposed to defend the continental United States. We can absolutely include Marine ground forces in that. The Marines are effectively part of the larger ground force. There's no mission for them at sea these days to do anything of importance. So that's fine. But let's get it straight. We are at war with the cartels. Let's act as though we are at war, because we are. And prepare for what's going to happen inside our country when these deportations finally get off the ground. When you start moving large numbers of people, the cartels are going to fight us inside our country. They're losing money. They're losing their mules. They're losing their networks. What do you think they're going to do? Stand by and do nothing? They're going to fight back. So let's treat this as a wartime mission right now. Get ourselves organized on that border. Get ourselves organized for what we need to do internally. Let's have a plan. Are we going to attack this across the nation, coast to coast, all at once? I don't think so. We're probably going to move through different phases. How are we going to phase the operation? There is a difference between people that broke the law to come into the country and have stayed here in the hopes of making money or improving themselves, and criminals that came into the country to commit more crimes. We understand that. Have we made provisions for it? Do we tell everyone who's here illegally they have 120 days to get out? And if they get out voluntarily, they can take with them whatever they've made, whatever they own, and they can register with us on the way out. And we know who they are. And if we can open this up to wider immigration in the future, they can be readmitted. Do we want to do something like that? Do we at the same time say, if you are not out of here in 120 days, we're coming after you. We will confiscate all of your property. You will be treated as a criminal and you will be jailed or worse as a result. In other words, where are the teeth in all of this? Announcing that we rounded up some Venezuelan gang members is wonderful. That's just a one-off. What's the larger strategy, the larger plan? Let's focus the American people on that. Let's focus the armed forces, particularly the Army, and happy to have the Marines involved in this as well. But where's the chain of command? Who's directing all of this? I don't think that Tom Homan, as the border czar, can run this thing.
You brought up a great point about the military-industrial complex and getting their new fancy weapons. And we talked about this on the show earlier this week, which is, you have these neocons who desperately want to continue the massive amount of money that's being funneled to these different defense contractors. And by having our focus internally on the United States, it's not shiny. It's not good for them. We need these wars around the world. We need the Middle East. We need Ukraine. We need Libya. We need Syria. We need Africa. And by bringing, 20,000 troops back home from Europe and putting them in the United States, it's not as exciting for the military-industrial complex. And so you have these people. Are you worried at all about the neocons, the people that are swarming around President Trump, pushing him in different directions on this?
Well, I think it's pretty clear that most of the people that currently surround the president certainly are not aligned with the views that he expressed in his run-up to the election or the views that he has expressed previously. He seems to be very bellicose right now. We're talking about things like Greenland. Here's a blinding flash of the obvious. Ever since the end of the Second World War, everything that happens militarily in the Arctic, in other words, towards the North Pole, whether it's Canada, the United States, Greenland, guess what? We control it. There's nothing going to happen in Greenland that we don't want to happen there. The Danes are NATO members. We've never had problems with the Danes. We have a base in Greenland. We can come to all sorts of arrangements. There's no requirement for bellicose rhetoric or threats from anybody to do anything in the Arctic that is in the interest of the United States, Canada, Greenland, Norway, and so forth. So I don't know why everybody is so focused on that at this point. The same thing is true down in Panama. People are saying, well, the Chinese are taking over. No, the Chinese have contracts to repair infrastructure at each end of the canal. Why do the Chinese have contracts to repair infrastructure at these ports? Because our firms decline to do the work. If you don't want the Chinese there to do the work, then buy out the Chinese contracts. The Chinese will eagerly leave, go elsewhere. We can take over the contracts and we can report or repair those ports. We've got to get back to reality. You know, there is no threat to us and our national security from Panama other than illegal immigration. That's a different matter entirely. And we have failed miserably to deal with that. In fact, the last administration did everything it possibly could to enhance it and expand it to do as much damage as possible before they were finally thrown out of office. That's another issue. But we're focused on all sorts of things that don't make any sense, and that's true overseas. The Trump administration thus far has not produced anything that makes any sense in connection with Ukraine. The only thing we've heard from the president that does make sense is that he has theoretically said, I'm suspending all military aid to Ukraine. Perhaps he meant all aid of all kinds, but at least military aid. The problem is that doesn't seem to be happening yet. And one of the problems that President Trump had during his first term was failure inside the White House to follow up to ensure that the president's orders and directives were obeyed. I'm hearing that they're not being obeyed. In fact, we just flew something in the neighborhood of 90 Patriot missiles from Israel to Ukraine. Now, these were missiles that the Israelis were about to dismantle and dispose of because they were old. Somebody decided, well, let's ship them to Ukraine. Does President Trump know about that these missiles were sent to Ukraine? I doubt it. Did anybody consult him? Did anybody ask for permission? And remember that all of the aid, for all intents and purposes, is fundamentally illegal because Congress has never voted for any of it. All of this presidential action under Biden was illegal, unconstitutional. He simply made decisions and shipped the aid. So where is President Trump on all these things? I'm not sure I know. I don't know where he is. But the second part, and this is very important, the war against Ukraine is over. Oh, they're still killing Ukrainians. Of course, there are still pockets of Ukrainians here or there in eastern Ukraine, but they're dying in great numbers. Now they're surrendering again in great numbers. But the point is, what is our role in all of this? What makes us think that we can walk into a discussion between Russia and Kiev and dictate anything? All we've done is try to harm Russia. How can we possibly be admitted to any negotiation as an objective partner? It's impossible. We don't have any forces to send into Western Ukraine, neither do the West Europeans or the East Europeans. If they tried to send them in there to enforce anything, they'd be annihilated by the current Russian military establishment. And Russia has not been harmed at all. We now know the true facts. The true figures are beginning finally to come out. We think at least 1 million to 1.2 million Ukrainian soldiers have been killed. Now, this isn't news to me. It's not news to Scott Ritter. It's not news to a lot of us. And we also know that somewhere between 90 and 100,000 Russian soldiers have been killed. Think about that. 90 to 100,000 have been killed. That's a terrible number. We lost 58,000 in Vietnam, plus 100,000 wounded. This is worse than Vietnam, certainly for the Russians in that sense. But this pales before the losses taken by the Ukrainians. Ukraine as a nation state is finished. What are we going to do? Instead of trying to bully Russia, which is not going to work, and threaten more harm to Russia or sanction it or tariff it, we need to sit down and figure out how Ukraine, whatever is left of it, is going to be salvaged. And that definitely needs to be neutral, because the Russians aren't going to refight another war in 5 or 10 years if we come back and try to turn Western Ukraine into some sort of platform for attack against Russia. Right now, Europe is in chaos. All the major governments are about to be thrown out of office. Right-wing nationalists are coming to power. Now, what are these right-wing nationalists coming to power in Austria, have already come to power in Hungary and Slovakia, who we will see come to power in most of the rest of Europe. They're not interested in going to war with Russia. They don't want to go to war with anyone. They want to preserve their countries, their national identity, their national culture. They want secure borders. These people are going to walk away from us because we've destroyed them. We've dragged them into this terrible, terrible war with Russia. We've crushed their economies. It's only a matter of time now until you have a government in Berlin that turns to us and says, get out. Now think about that.
Remarkable. And you saw over the past 24 hours, the Trump administration pushing for a return to discussions individually with the countries, not Brussels, not the EU itself as an entity, but individual countries negotiating with the United States. We've heard also over the past couple of weeks some blustering from NATO, and that there would be a peacekeeping mission to Ukraine to the tune of maybe 100,000, 200,000 troops, NATO peacekeepers. Zelensky has called for that, saying that U.S. troops and NATO peacekeepers, soldiers need to be put in Ukraine to solidify Ukraine going forward. Of course, as you point out, that would never happen. Russia would destroy those quote-unquote peacekeepers. What do you make of NATO's role in all of this now? And is it in alignment with where the Trump administration wants to go?
Well, the Trump administration needs to make clear where it wants to go. I don't think it's clear yet. President Trump should say, this is not our war. I didn't start this war. I would not have started this war, and I want to end this war. The quickest way to do that is suspend all further military aid and immediately withdraw all U.S. personnel from Ukraine, in and out of uniform, intelligence, everything, and get out. That's how this thing should end immediately. As far as the Europeans are concerned, as soon as it becomes clear that we're not going to invest another dime in the place, they're going to go home. They have no money to waste on Ukraine. They've put themselves into debt. They've crushed their own economies on our behalf in support of this crazy notion that we were going to harm Russia. Russia's economy is stronger and healthier now than it's ever been. The Russian military establishment is arguably the best and the most potent and dangerous military establishment on the planet. All of this is thanks to us. So what about NATO? NATO's irrelevant. It's an empty facade. What about the EU? It too is dead man walking. All of these institutions that we've lived with for 80 years or a little less than 80 years are all vanishing. They're all going to go away. So what President Trump needs to say is, I'm leaving. I'm getting out. And it's time for the Europeans to talk directly to Moscow and hammer out a solution. And we will be happy to support that in whatever way possible. But we cannot take the lead. How could we possibly take the lead when we have people like Lindsey Graham celebrating the deaths of Russians on the battlefield, saying that the loss of over 1 million Ukrainian lives is a good thing because it, quote unquote, harmed Russia, when we all know that hasn't happened. But Ukraine itself is dead. We can't take the lead on any of this stuff. And then at the same time, we're sitting around waiting for the next shoe to drop in the Middle East. It's astonishing that neither the Israelis nor the Iranians have done anything to this point in time. I really thought that by now we would be in a full-fledged war. But Mr. Netanyahu has chosen to take his time. He's gone along at least to the first phase of this ceasefire. But at the same time, under great pressure from Netanyahu and his agents in the United States, Mr. Trump has released all the 2,000-pound bombs that Mr. Netanyahu wants. Well, what do we use 2,000-pound bombs to do? Well, we destroy cities with 2,000-pound bombs. We kill large numbers of people. I rather suspect that's what they are going to be used for by the Israelis. So where is this thing in the Middle East going? Mr. Trump has foolishly called the Egyptians and the Jordanians, both of whom have very, very fragile societies and economies, and said, I want you to take 1.5 million refugees, Palestinian Arabs, all of whom do not want to leave their land, do not want to leave their homes, even though they're destroyed, and take them into your country so that we can make way for future Israeli settlements, so we can build out the beachfront property that we see is so valuable in Israel. Is that insane? Now we want to exchange the deaths of tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people for better beachfront property for a select few people who happen to be Jewish. Isn't that nice? What planet are we on?
One question that came up in a recent interview with Kurt Mills and Tucker Carlson is the relationship between Benjamin Netanyahu and President Trump. President Trump has, over the past couple of months, indicated that he is perhaps not a fan of Netanyahu. And it seemed this week when Netanyahu thanked Trump for releasing those 2,000-pound bombs, he released a video message, which was odd. It seemed like a large virtue signaling. In some ways, maybe to undermine Trump, I don't know. We're all sort of reading into it, but why wouldn't he just sort of send him a private note of thanks? Then Trump responded on social media saying, I had nothing to do with this transaction. He paid for these under President Biden, and I simply allowed it to happen, I guess. So where do you think this relationship is? How tenuous is it? And how much longer do you think Benjamin Netanyahu will be in power?
Well, like most politicians, I'm afraid that President Trump wants to be a little bit pregnant. Most politicians don't really want to bring the child to term. They just want to be a little bit pregnant and tell everybody, see, I'm doing good things. We're bringing this child into the world. But whether or not the child ever comes to full term, forget it. Nobody cares. Actually, nobody wants it to. What I mean by that is that President Trump is sending him the 2,000-pound bombs, which he doesn't have to send. The president of the United States has authority over anything that is shipped overseas. Remember, when it comes to foreign and defense policy, the chief executive of the United States has final authority. We have impounded Russian money, Russian property without hesitation. Why are we not stopping the movement of these 2,000-pound bombs to Israel? Because he doesn't want to do that. Why would he not want to do that? Well, we need to come to terms with an important reality. Mr. Trump would probably not be president of the United States right now had Mr. Netanyahu's supporters here in the United States not poured a great deal of money and support into his campaign. And it's not just a question of pouring money and support into his campaign. It's turning off opposition on the other side that was Jewish, that didn't like Trump, by saying, no, you're going to support us now because this is what we want for Israel. Mark Zuckerberg had a huge impact during the last election in 2020, turning out all sorts of people in all sorts of places in big cities to mobilize minority votes and others to defeat Trump. Where was he this time? He was absent. And he's not the Lone Ranger. So Mr. Netanyahu has a great deal to say right now about what President Trump does or does not do. I would say he has veto power for the most part. And this is very dangerous because what he's doing, Netanyahu, his policies, they are not in our interest as Americans. Our position in the Middle East is being destroyed. Some would argue it's already dead. No one there believes anything we say. We are seen as enabling and supporting the mass expulsion and mass murder of Arabs in Gaza. In fact, one can argue we've done pretty much the same thing in southern Lebanon, and there's readiness and preparation to do even more. Egypt and Jordan are effectively dependent upon us for money. We continue to send billions of dollars to them, but they still can't take in any Palestinian Arabs because they know that would destabilize their countries and that would liquidate the Palestinian cause for good. So they're not going to do it, even though they're heavily dependent upon us. It's time for us to wake up. How far do we want to go? How far are we going to bankroll and support this greater Israel project? And now Mr. Witkoff, who is the gentleman chosen by President Trump to be the lead on the Middle East in policy, has suggested sending all of these Palestinians to Indonesia. Well, that's a brilliant statement. This is a man representing the United States government, representing the State Department. I don't know of any discussions with Indonesia about that, nor do I see any probability of that happening. Why is he saying that? Again, I go back to my comments on the border. Who is in charge? Is Trump in charge? Does he know what's really happening? He's made a lot of statements recently that would suggest he has no idea of the damage we've done in the Middle East. We haven't even talked about the Kurds and their position vis-a-vis the Turks. We haven't touched on a whole range of things. And again, we haven't talked again about the Chinese hype threat nonsense about Taiwan. The truth is, it doesn't make any difference to us who governs Taiwan. If the Japanese want it, they can have it. If the Chinese want to invade it, they can have it. It's not our affair. We are not interested in defending the place. President Trump knows that. Well, let's be a little more straightforward and start making it clear what we will or will not do. And he needs to start right away in the Middle East. How much further does he want to go? Does he really want to risk an all-out war with Iran that's definitely going to bring in Russia and could conceivably at some point also bring in the Turks? Are we going to fight the whole Islamic world? That certainly seems to be the long-term strategic goal of Mr. Netanyahu, that we should. But is that what Mr. Trump wants?
I would love to ask him. I would love to sit down and ask him these questions, and we are trying to. By the way, I'll get you out of here on this, Colonel. Is there anyone around President Trump right now militarily who you trust, who you say, I'm glad that person is there, because everything you just laid out here, anyone who is on the same wavelength as what you just laid out here, who has Trump's ear?
Well, first of all, the people that he's put on the agenda for the Pentagon, in other words, in the Department of Defense, people in the Office of Secretary of Defense, I don't know them all personally. I know some of them. Some of them have had what I would call Damascus conversions. They'd spent years beating the drums for war with China and are now backing down from that stupid idea. Many of them are saying, we don't want to be at war with Russia now. We need to rethink that. But having said that, nobody knows how to do anything. There doesn't seem to be any will to do anything. I know everyone is celebrating the demise of this thing called diversity, equity, and inclusion. I understand that. But quite frankly, that could be done very quickly without much fanfare through an executive order. The other problems that we have are far greater. We have this enormous military structure that's costing us $1 trillion a year. We can't afford it. We have a fiscal crisis, we have a financial crisis, and we're looking at a very weak economy. What are we going to do about that? Where are we going to cut spending? No one ever talks about it. But just keep in mind that the largest portion of discretionary spending in the budget is the Department of Defense. And I can guarantee you that before we cut Medicare, Medicaid, or Social Security, we will go after defense. We have to. So what are we going to do? Where do we cut? How do we do it? Is this going to be a stampede under pressure when the stock market crashes? And it will. And the interest rates that we can no longer control continue to rise. I mean, just stop and think. We have, on the one hand, Powell, who is trying to suppress interest rates. And on the other hand, the 10-year Treasury bond continues to climb, approaching 5%. That 5% ceiling is as much psychological as fiscal. When you hit that 5%, all bets off. We can't service the debt anymore without going under. So when do we deal with these things? Politicians tend to deal with these things when they have no choice.
Right.
That's a bad approach. That's a bad strategy. President Trump won the election. He has a lot of credibility and clout right now. He needs to deal with these things. And the first thing he needs to do to cut spending is to get all these forces out of Europe. He started that with 20,000 from Germany. That's the tip of the proverbial iceberg. We have a vast surface fleet in the United States Navy. Those things are largely target arrays today on the modern ocean. Surface fleets, as we've seen them since 1915, are probably obsolete. We can't protect them anymore. Precision-guided munitions, precision strike from the air, from the sky, from the seas. It's too dangerous, too lethal. We can make a lot of very important changes, but we've got to change our strategy. Strategy is everything. Right now, our strategy is still to be everywhere all the time for everyone. We can't afford it. It's got to go away. We've got to defend the Western Hemisphere. And we have to defend our country, our continental United States, the heart of our nation. That is what the border is about. It's not just the border. It's about the survival of our country in every sense. And we have to come home to defend it. We got to get out of this business of cultivating conflict, looking for places to intervene, looking for wars to start. Unfortunately, those people are still around President Trump. And they will always say to President Trump, well, listen, boss, you don't want to say that or do that. You'll look weak. You'll look weak. That's what people told Nixon. in 1969 after he became president. Oh, you can't just leave Vietnam. We'll look weak. We know now, because we got into the NKVD archives, that the Soviets at the time thought we were nuts to be in Vietnam to begin with and couldn't understand why we were still there after Nixon was elected. So instead, we stayed for a few more years, and we took terrible casualties. And ultimately, Nixon became responsible for the Vietnam War when he had nothing to do with it. It was LBJ who did it. Well, this is going to happen to Donald Trump. If he doesn't fish or cut bait, and in my judgment, he needs to cut bait, he needs to cut the losses, put an end to the nonsense in Eastern Europe, get the forces out of Europe. The Russians are not invading Western Europe. They don't want to invade Western Europe. They've got their own problems. They want to do business. We got to get out of all this bullying, bribing, and bombing. That's all we do. We bully, we bribe, we bomb. That's not the answer. We need real diplomacy and some useful strategic thinking. And that means America first. Not Ukraine first, not Israel first, America first.
Has anyone from the Trump administration reached out to you to become part of the Trump administration this time?
No.
Would you?
Right now, it would be utterly pointless. The people who are being appointed to all the key positions in defense and industry, defense and State Department, I just don't see any good news really on the horizon. Perhaps that changes, but I don't think so. Again, it's back to our earlier point. When do political leaders do something about the problems? When they're compelled to do so.
When it's too late.
Right now, everybody is saying, oh, we're so glad to have President Trump. I'm glad to have President Trump. I voted for the man. But we got to get past the afterglow. Now we got to get down to business. You know, Churchill used to say, I can't promise you anything but blood, sweat, and tears. He was right. Trump needs to come out and make the same kind of statement. The place that I've inherited is a catastrophe. I can't fix it overnight. Stop talking about, in a year and 2 years and 3 years. Forget it. It's going to take a decade or more for us to recover from the damage that's been done to us. He needs to be truthful about that.
And Churchill also said Americans tend to do the right thing only after they've exhausted all other options. So, a lot to learn from Churchill here. I hope it's not too late for us to fix all of this. Colonel Douglas Macgregor, man, I sure hope people are paying attention to you. And I sure hope that Trump is asking these tough questions and he's able to think in this way, because it's so vitally important right now. Thank you so much, as always, and great to see you, Colonel.
Thanks, Clayton. All the best.
Thanks, Colonel.